I don't think I could do this anymore. I don't know why, but I'm okay with walking away from this because there's no way I'm dragging down the legacy.
20,000 people came to Madison Square Garden expecting to hear a rock legend finish what he started. Instead, they watched him place a hand over his heart and admit, in front of a sold-out arena, that he could not continue. What happened on the night of July 23, 2026, looked to most fans like a bad night brought on by a sinus infection. But for anyone who had followed Jon Bon Jovi's last decade closely, that explanation was only the surface of something far more painful, a physical unraveling more than 10 years in the making. The show had started like any other stop on his long-awaited Forever tour. Fans who had already sat through the previous 7 nights of this residency noticed something was wrong almost immediately. The power that had defined his voice for over 4 decades wasn't there. In its place was a thinner, more strained sound, one that seemed to weaken with every song. This wasn't an artist having an ordinary off night. This was a body failing in real time, in front of thousands of people who had traveled and paid significant money to witness his return to the stage. The band pushed through 14 songs that night, well short of the 20+ they typically performed during this residency. By the time they reached Bed of Roses, Jon could barely get through the vocal line, and he stepped back from the mic, letting the crowd carry the final section for him. Before what would become the last song of the evening, he spoke to the audience with a level of honesty rarely seen from a performer mid-collapse. He told them he knew he was letting them down, that this wasn't who he was, and that he needed their help because he was in real pain. Train frontman Pat Monahan, who happened to be in the audience that night as a fan, was pulled backstage and brought out to help carry the vocals on Living on a Prayer. Even with Monahan's help, Jon leaned heavily on the crowd to finish the song. When it ended, he asked fans not to throw away their ticket stubs, promised he would find a way to make it up to them, embraced each of his bandmates, and walked off stage. His team later cited a sinus infection as the reason. Technically accurate, perhaps, but for those who had been paying attention to the 2 shows before it, the explanation felt incomplete. 2 nights earlier, the band had quietly trimmed some of their biggest anthems from the setlist and shortened the runtime without any public comment. It was a pattern, not an accident, and it pointed to something that had been building far longer than a head cold could explain. To understand what really happened at Madison Square Garden, you have to go back more than a decade, to a night in 2013 that most fans never connected to what came later. That year, guitarist Richie Sambora abruptly left the band hours before a scheduled performance in Calgary, in the middle of the Because We Can tour. Sambora had struggled with addiction for years, and he later said his exit came down to family circumstances and the need to be present for his daughter. What most people didn't realize at the time was what his departure did to Jon's voice. Sambora wasn't simply the lead guitarist, he was the other half of a vocal partnership that had shaped the band's sound for 3 decades. When he walked away, Jon was left to finish 80 remaining tour dates essentially singing for 2 people, absorbing both his own parts and the harmonies Sambora had always carried. Jon later told AARP Magazine that everything began to deteriorate after that tour, and that even he couldn't say for certain whether the damage was more psychological or physical. By 2015, the signs were becoming harder to hide, a growing breathiness in his voice, reduced volume, moments where his pitch would slip unexpectedly. Speaking on the How to Fail podcast, Jon described his body as having essentially crashed underneath him without his full awareness of how severe it had become. He tried nearly everything to fix it on his own terms. In the Hulu docuseries Thank You, Goodnight, he ran through the list: laser treatments, acupuncture, vitamin regimens, collagen injections, targeted exercises. Between 2015 and 2019, he kept touring anyway, forcing his way through performance after performance while the very instrument his career depended on kept quietly breaking down beneath him. Then the pandemic arrived, and the 2-year touring shutdown that hit every musician on the planet did nothing to repair Jon's voice. If anything, it exposed just how far it had already declined. When Bon Jovi returned to live performance in 2022, the difference was unmistakable. And the person who finally said out loud what everyone around him had been too afraid to say was the one person he could never doubt. After a 2022 arena show in Nashville, Jon walked off stage believing he had given the crowd everything he had. He turned to his wife, Dorothea, and told her it had gone well. She told him, gently but plainly, that it hadn't been great, and that she had seen him be great before. Jon and Dorothea have been together since high school, married since 1989, and present for every stage of Bon Jovi's now 4-decade run. Jon later described that conversation to People magazine as devastating, but said there was no one else on earth he would have trusted to tell him the truth. He explained that everyone else around a performer at that level falls into one of three categories: people being paid to be there, people too starstruck to be honest, or people who want so badly for you to succeed that they can't see clearly. Dorothea, he said, was different. She was the one person who would never soften the truth for his comfort. What's striking is what his mind did with that honesty. He admitted that the instant he processed her words, the first thought in his head wasn't about doctors or rest, it was that it might be time to retire. That instinctive leap tells you something about the weight he had been quietly carrying, likely for years, without saying it to anyone. For a man whose entire identity had been built around his voice, the fear of losing it wasn't just a professional worry. It was closer to an existential one. Within days, Jon drove himself to the hospital. Not an assistant, not a scheduled appointment weeks out, he got behind the wheel alone, driven by an urgency to understand exactly what was happening to him. What the doctors found was worse than anything he had imagined. One of his vocal cords had atrophied. In the Hulu docuseries, he described how vocal cords are supposed to sit parallel to each other, roughly matched in thickness. His had not. One had swollen dramatically while the other had shrunk down to a fraction of its size, leaving the stronger cord physically shoving the weaker one out of position every time he tried to sing. In his own description, that cord was dying. Doctors told him part of this was simply the natural thinning that happens to vocal folds with age. But 4 decades of performing at an extreme level, belting arena anthems multiple nights a week for most of his adult life, had sped up that decline far beyond what would be considered typical. Jon was genuinely baffled by the diagnosis, because he had always treated his voice with real discipline. He'd never smoked, never touched drugs, always warmed up before shows and cooled down afterward. He pointed out to The Independent that he had trained as a vocalist for decades and had even performed alongside Pavarotti. This wasn't a case of an amateur wrecking an untrained instrument through carelessness. His body had simply worn out the thing he depended on most, despite doing almost everything right. The surgical solution was a procedure called medialization, in which surgeons placed 2 pieces of Gore-Tex material around the outside of the vocal cords, positioned inside the neck, to push the weakened cord back into alignment so both sides could vibrate symmetrically again. Jon described it, half-jokingly, as a facelift for his vocal cords. The operation itself was considered successful. But surgery was only the starting point of what turned into a 3-year process of relearning how to use his own voice. 19 months after the procedure, Jon still couldn't commit to touring. The band had a finished album ready for release, but nobody, including Jon himself, knew whether their frontman would ever be able to stand in front of a stadium crowd again. He admitted there were long stretches of genuine doubt during that period, moments where he'd find a small flicker of hope only to feel set back again days later. He told the Today Show that returning to the stage required being physically, mentally, and spiritually ready, and for a long time, he simply wasn't. In April 2024, he gave an interview to the Sunday Times that rattled the music world. He said plainly that if his singing wasn't at the level it needed to be, if he couldn't be the performer he once was, then he'd walk away and be at peace with that decision. He compared the moment to a quarterback who knows he's about to throw his final pass. And then he said something that captured exactly what he feared most, that he refused to become a version of himself people would pity, a diminished echo trading on nostalgia rather than genuine ability. While Jon spent every day fighting through vocal therapy, uncertain whether the work would ever pay off, something remarkable was happening around him. Not one member of the band walked away. Nobody quietly moved on to other projects or floated retirement as an option. Tico Torres stayed at the drums. David Bryan stayed at the keys. Phil X, Hugh McDonald, John Shanks, and Everett Bradley kept showing up to rehearsals as though a tour date already existed, even when there was no date on the calendar and no certainty one would ever come. Jon later told People magazine that the sacrifices his bandmates made during that stretch were on another level entirely, and that watching them stay by his side through years of uncertainty only deepened how much he loved them. Even Richie Sambora, absent from the band since his 2013 departure, publicly said he'd return if Jon recovered his voice. He told the Alison Hagendorf show that he had songs ready to go and believed the world needed the band back together, 13 years after the very exit that had set this entire chain of events in motion. That kind of statement tells you just how significant this comeback had become to everyone connected to it, not just to Jon. In October 2025, Jon appeared on the Today Show and announced the Forever Tour, anchored by 9 sold-out nights at Madison Square Garden. The comeback was officially real. On July 7, 2026, the lights dropped inside a packed garden. There was no opening act. Just after 7:30, the spotlight found the stage, and Bon Jovi walked out. Jon opened not with one of his own anthems but with a soulful cover of With a Little Help from My Friends, in the gospel-tinged arrangement popularized by Joe Cocker, a choice loaded with meaning after 4 years of silence, surgery, therapy, and doubt. He told the crowd he hadn't heard a live audience in 4 years and thanked them for waiting. Early reviews were honest but encouraging. His voice was clearly different from the version fans remembered from the 1980s. He stayed more anchored to one spot, leaning on the mic stand or his guitar rather than sprinting across the stage. But he made it through a 21-song set, proof that his body could handle the physical demands of a full show. Over the following nights, fans flew in from around the world, with multiple languages audible in the Garden's concourse on any given evening. But 9 shows packed into under 3 weeks is a grueling schedule for any singer, let alone one whose vocal cords were being held in place by surgical implants. By night 6, cracks were already showing. Wanted Dead or Alive and Always, 2 of the most vocally demanding songs in the catalogue, were quietly dropped. By night 8, his body made the decision that his will couldn't override. Before he left the stage on July 23, Jon made a promise that carried enormous weight. He told the crowd to hold on to their ticket stubs, that he'd find a way to make the show up to them, that he felt fine, and that he'd see them again soon. In the days that followed, the final Garden date and all 5 European stadium shows, Edinburgh, Dublin, and 3 nights at Wembley, remained on the schedule. The stakes of pulling any of them, financially and emotionally, were enormous, not just for the band but for the tens of thousands of fans who had already booked flights and hotels around the world. But 2 years earlier, Jon had already drawn a line for himself. He said he'd never be the artist who pushed through a diminished version of his own performance out of ego or obligation. The man who once drove himself